Airplane technology developed quickly in the 1950s, partly due to the competition of the Cold War. After Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 in 1947, planes simply became faster and faster. In 1962, the Soviets introduced the Tupolev Tu-22, the world's first supersonic bomber aircraft. The American answer was a plane that was both ahead of and behind the times. The XB-70 Valkyrie was an amazing piece of cutting-edge technology that was based on outdated strategic thinking. And a tragic midair collision in 1966 with the prototype demonstrated the failings of an ambitious but troubled program. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1955, the U.S. Air Force issued a general operational requirement for an aircraft that could effectively deploy the nuclear weapons of the day. The requirement offered a challenge. The aircraft would have to be large enough to carry the weapons, which at the time weighed many tons, from the continental United States to the Soviet Union, and then be able to achieve supersonic speeds to escape the blast radius of the weapon. Building and fueling a supersonic plane that large would be pressing the envelope of the technology of the time. The plane would need to have the range and payload of a B-52, but the speed of a B-58 Hustler. Two paths were pursued simultaneously. One tested the prospect of a nuclear-fueled aircraft. The other would press the boundaries of capabilities from a conventional engine. The plane would require a combat radius of 4,000 nautical miles with a payload capacity of 50,000 pounds. It could have a subsonic cruising speed, Mach 0.9, but need to be able to achieve supersonic speed during the 1,000-mile entrance and exit to the target, called the dash. Original designs used fuel tanks that would drop off when depleted and wing sections that would be jettisoned to change the shape of the wing. The designs were deemed too complicated, but advances were being made in supersonic flight, and new designs were on the horizon. New research focused on a narrow delta wing. There, the research had found a surprising result. At supersonic speeds, such wings burned more fuel, but were more fuel efficient. That is, while supersonic, they burned fuel at twice the speed as when subsonic, but were 4 times as fast. From a fuel-to-mile ratio, the plan with subsonic cruising speed and a supersonic dash made no sense. The new designs would use supersonic speeds the entire route. The advanced design ideas took advantage of new developments. For example, they suggested using boron-enriched high-energy fuel for the afterburners. The so-called zip fuel offered a great deal of extra energy, extending range. They also leveraged a new idea discovered through wind tunnel experiments on re-entering nuclear warheads called compression lift. At supersonic speeds, the nose of the plane would create compression waves. The plane could gain additional lift by carefully designing the aircraft to ride these waves. The concept is much the same as a boat that planes on its own wake. While the concept itself is basic, leveraging it on aircraft is highly complex. The concept still tested the outer limits of technology at the time and offered significant issues, among them cooling the significant heat caused by friction on leading edges at supersonic speeds. But the new requirements called for a plane with a cruising speed of Mach 3 to 3.2, an over-target altitude of 70,000 to 75,000 feet, a range of up to 10,500 miles, and a gross weight not to exceed 490,000 pounds. North American Aviation won the contract with an advanced design designated the B-70. The Air Force had a naming contest in 1958, and with an X added to denote the experimental prototype, the North American XB-70 Valkyrie was born. The XB-70 is an amazing aircraft, 196 feet long, 31 feet high at the tail, with a wingspan of 105 feet, powered by 6 turbojet engines. It is still, to date, the only potential production manned aircraft design to effectively leverage compression lift. And it was an outdated concept before the prototype was even built. As impressive as it is, and it is worth a visit to the Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, just to see it, the XB-70 Valkyrie was based on concepts that were already fading. As bombers developed, the idea had been to make them fly faster and higher to escape both enemy anti-aircraft artillery and fighter aircraft. The XB-70 represents the high end of that philosophy. But by the late 1950s, anti-aircraft missiles were already demonstrating the weakness in that philosophy. Missiles could hit planes at any altitude and any speed. In fact, lower altitude ground-hugging bombers offered better defense against anti-aircraft missiles than supersonic high-altitude bombers like the B-70 and had far lower operating costs. And as a delivery system for nuclear bombs, the rapidly developing nuclear missiles were more effective. Fleets of supersonic high-altitude bombers were simply not worth the expense. The B-70 program was canceled in 1959. The plane saw a brief reprieve in the presidential campaign of 1960, where both Democrat John Kennedy and Republican Richard Nixon were trying to portray each other as soft on defense. But by 1961, Kennedy was convinced that the plane was an unnecessary expense. In 1962, the massive spending that had already gone into the project would end up with a production of just 2 experimental aircraft that would be used to test various concepts of supersonic flight. The first of the XB-70 prototypes made its maiden flight on September 21st, 1964. As impressive as the aerodynamic design was, the XB-70 was troubled in a number of ways. The design was vast and complex, and mechanical problems dogged every flight. The plane operated by stick and rudder controls, with complex supersonic airframe that, in reality, required digital computer assistance that had not yet been invented to fly. The planes were flying Mach 3, but their operation was troubled. The extent of the problems was demonstrated starkly in a test flight by the second of the 2 prototypes on April 30th, 1966. Shortly after takeoff from Edwards Air Force Base, the plane's landing gear retraction system shorted out. As a result of this malfunction, the nose gear was blown back into the partially retracted gear well door, slashing the tires. The crew, test pilots Al White and Joe Cotton, tried to lower the gear to land, but the hydraulic system failed. The front landing gear was stuck and not locked into position. The problem was significant. There is no way to belly land a supersonic jet. Cotton and White would either have to get the landing gear to extend normally, or the plane could not land. White and Cotton would have to bail out, and the $750 million prototype would be lost. The crew first tried touch-and-go landings, dangerous in such a large plane, hoping to force the front gear into locked position. It was a daring idea, but it didn't work. It looked like the plane was going to be lost. But White and Cotton had 2 more hours in the air to burn the fuel in the tanks, and that allowed them time to work the problem. They decided the best chance was to try to short-circuit the landing gear retraction system, but they didn't have the proper tools. Then Cotton came up with a solution. He dug in his briefcase and found a binder-type paperclip. He was able to short-circuit the breaker with the clip. The gear locked down, but Cotton and White had to land with the nose wheel tires slashed and no hydraulic pressure on one of the 4 main brake wheels. On landing, the gear exploded into flames, but the fire crews at Edwards were able to extinguish them before significant damage was done to the plane. The $750 million prototype was saved by a 2-cent paperclip. The incident was not isolated. Cotton, for example, recalled a flight when an 18-inch by 10-foot wide section of wing came off the aircraft at Mach 3. He said it was like you woke up with an elephant in bed with you. That's how evident it was. The issues would turn to tragedy on June 8th, 1966. Again, the plane involved was the second prototype, aircraft number 62-0207, the same one that had had the problem with the landing gear. Al White was back in the cockpit, this time with Major Carl Cross, piloting the XB-70 for the first time. Joe Cotton was there as well, in the observer seat of a Northrop T-38 Talon jet trainer trailing the flight. The XB-70 is powered by 6 General Electric YJ-93 turbojet engines, grouped in a single large duct under the aircraft, part of the design that allowed the compression lift. That day, GE stockholders were being shown an observation flight, a photo opportunity where the VIPs would get to see the XB-70 flying in formation with a number of other planes. The day was described as having Kodachrome picturesque conditions, with high scattered clouds over Southern California's Edwards Air Force Base. The observers were in a Gates Learjet, the best option that would allow a good view and still be able to keep up. The Valkyrie was to fly in formation, with the Northrop T-38A carrying Joe Cotton, a McDonnell F-4B Phantom, a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, and a Northrop YFA Freedom Fighter, all planes with GE engines. Cross and White had done some calibration runs earlier in the XB-70, and the photo run was added to the agenda. The F-104 was civilian registered and being flown by legendary test pilot Joseph A. Walker, who at the time held the world's records for flight altitude and speed. Walker had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 7 oak leaf clusters flying P-38 Lightnings during the Second World War. After the war, he became a research pilot with the Edwards Flight Research Facility. He flew the Bell X-1, a version of which would become the first plane to break the sound barrier. He was chief test pilot for the Douglas X-3 Stiletto and was one of only a dozen pilots to fly the record-breaking North American X-15. He frequently flew chase aircraft for NASA and so was highly skilled at the maneuvering used for the demonstration flight of the XB-70, although he reportedly questioned the purpose of the flight as it did not contribute to the research being done with the Valkyrie. The XB-70 would be flying at 25,000 feet with the other aircraft in a wedge formation, with two trailing off its wings on either side. Walker in the F-104 was on the right side, next to the wing. It was not an easy position for a short-nosed fighter built for high-speed intercepts, not slow-speed photo opportunities. He was in a difficult position, trying to maintain a visually appealing distance from the F-5A to his right. The wing of the Delta Wing Valkyrie was behind him, and he could not easily see it. NASA later determined that it would have been difficult to assess his relative position simply by watching the Valkyrie's fuselage to his left. But the experienced pilot maintained the formation for nearly 40 minutes, while the GE marketing people and VIPs took pictures from the nearby Learjet. Then it came time to break formation. As Walker went to separate, he clipped the wing of the Valkyrie. The XB-70 had been flying with its wingtips lowered, configured for low-speed flight. This not only placed them in an odd position behind Walker, but meant more air disruption behind the wing. Walker likely never saw the wing before the collision, and it is possible the airflow behind the wing sucked him towards the Valkyrie. Caught in the powerful vortices behind the Valkyrie's delta wing, his plane was flipped upside down, was flung sideways into the giant left stabilizer of the bomber, shearing most of it off and cutting the F-104 into pieces that damaged the other stabilizer on the Valkyrie's left wing. Joe Walker, the veteran test pilot and decorated World War II hero, was killed instantly. The flaming wreckage of the F-104 trailed behind the giant Valkyrie. Inside the XB-70, Cross and White didn't even know they'd been hit. The plane was so large that the collision didn't even register. As they were trying to understand the sudden radio traffic, the plane's controls started acting funny. The first sign that the stabilizer had been sheared from the plane. Air Force Captain Peter Hogg, piloting the T-38 with Joe Cotton, yelled into the radio, "Midair! Midair!" Without the stabilizers, the Valkyrie started to roll. White tried to manage the roll by controlling the throttles. The strategy had been successful in other aircraft. But the 6 engines of the XB-70 are all next to each other on center line, allowing little leverage to control direction via the engines. The roll and yaw quickly became unmanageable, and the VIPs in the Learjet watched in horror as the plane started to spin like a frisbee. Hogg yelled, "Eject! Eject! Eject!" The force from the spin was ripping the plane to pieces, and the wreck became surrounded in fuel vapor as the wing tanks ruptured. Somehow the fuel did not ignite, possibly because the plane was using JP-8 fuel that day instead of its normal, more flammable JP-4. The XB-70 had a special, in fact revolutionary system for crew ejection, designed to save the crew at supersonic speeds. Once activated, the system throws the crew member backwards into a pod, which closes around them and ejects. It's an amazing system, but the plane was not in level flight, but spinning wildly, subjecting the cockpit to all sorts of forces that confounded the system. White reacted quickly, and the system managed to perform, but he was thrown around so violently that his right arm was caught in the closing capsule. He pulled himself free, but the arm was shattered. Cross was not so lucky. The G-forces of the spinning plane prevented the seat from moving back into the capsule. He was pressed forward, unable to escape. Before his capsule ejected, White could see Cross press forward, but could do nothing to help. Hogg, seeing White's shoot, radioed, "Shoot! Shoot! Shoot!" But the second shoot never appeared. Cross was still with the plane as it pancaked into the California desert and exploded into flames. In his statement on the crash, President Lyndon Johnson said, "Joe Walker and Major Cross gave their lives in the development of science and technology. Their deaths remind us of how dependent we are on men of exceptional ability in the development of new vehicles in flight." In the resulting investigation, several Air Force officers, including Joe Cotton, were faulted for allowing the flight to occur. It was determined that the photo opportunity flight was only done under continued pressure from the advertising and marketing agency of General Electric. The plane, which cost the equivalent of $5 billion in 2019 dollars, and the 2 veteran pilots were lost for a corporate brochure. The plane that was lost, aircraft number 620207, was the more capable of the two prototypes, but the first prototype kept flying and for another 2 years tested concepts of supersonic flight and the effects of sonic booms. Its last flight was on February 4th, 1969, when it was flown from Edwards Air Force Base in California to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, where it was placed in the National Museum of the United States Air Force. And you can still see it there today, an impressive monument to a bygone era and to the extraordinary men who risked their lives to push the envelope of flight technology. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.